Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
Hello, everybody. Good morning to you and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio with Toria talking to Darren Leslie. I'm going to hand over to Toria in just a moment. Before I do that, it's a good time for me to mention our sponsors on the show this morning, which are John Catt Educational. If you haven't heard of John Catt, then check them out at johncattbookshop.com. They've got a huge range of professional development resources, mainly books, but lots of other things too for you to enjoy. And you can get 20% off any book at John Catt by using our code JCTTR2425 to get 20% off any book at johncattbookshop.com. I hope you enjoy the show this morning. I'm going to hand over to Toria.
Hi. Welcome everyone to the Sunday Social on Teachers Talk Radio with me, Toria Bono. And as Tom said, this show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational. Today we're discussing being armed with only a whiteboard, teaching without technology. Some people may call it good old-fashioned teaching, but how often is it actually happening in an age when digital technology is truly taking over in the classroom? Today, I'm joined by Darren Leslie. Darren is a Scottish teacher who's interested in Scottish education, the science of learning, reading, well, just so much actually. He's just passionate about education. Darren hosts the Becoming Educated podcast, which has over 90 episodes with guests such as Tom Sherrington, Rachel Ball, and Ross McGill, to name but a few. And I've got good news today because after taking a pause in 2024, Darren tells me he's bringing the podcast back in 2025. So yay! I'm also joined by Tom Rogers, who's there for those moments when everything live goes wrong. And of course, you, the listeners. If you're listening live and you want to join in the conversation, you've got two ways of doing that, either text in the show or request to speak on Spaces. It's always wonderful to hear the voices of others and find out what you're doing in your setting. So, without further ado, let's get on with the show. So, welcome, Darren. I can see that you're there. So,
Good morning.
welcome.
Good morning, Toria. How are you?
I'm great. Yes. How are you today?
Brilliant. Thank you. Good Sunday morning. I was up early with my son, and we've enjoyed a good walk and so on. He's currently obsessed with buses, so we go
Oh,
out to the road and try and spot as many buses as we can.
oh, I like that. I like when they've got a bit of a passion that's useful and, sort of a good bus passion is, yes. And does he like playing with buses as well? Have you got lots of sort of cars and buses at home that you play with?
Yes, we've got a few toys and buses and so on, those that make a lot of noise and just the usual. So enjoying that.
Well, all toys should make lots of noise, in my opinion. But that's not what we're here to discuss. We're here to discuss a post. Well, it started with a post you put on X a while ago that went quite mad, actually. So the post was all about, basically, could you teach if you were armed only with a whiteboard? I mean, how did that come about?
Well, it just came about because during the week, I went to teach a lesson, and of course, the technology broke down. And then I pivoted and just took a whiteboard pen and started teaching the class.
Mm.
And then, as the students were walking out, they were talking to me about how the lesson was so different and so much more enjoyable, and so much more interactive and so on. And it got me thinking about, well, you know, in some of these lessons, I use a PowerPoint, and some of them I don't. Some of them I try and mix it up. And then since that point, I've actually taught that class without any technology. And the children are telling me how much more they're enjoying the lessons. And I thought, well, why is that?
Mm.
And I then thought, um, I had a period of time where as you mentioned, where I've not been that involved on X or I stopped doing my podcast after my son was born to enjoy those moments. And he's now at an age where where I can get an hour here and there, um, and get back involved because you mentioned in the introduction. I'm extremely passionate about education,
Mm.
and I then thought I'll put out a poll. You know, what do teachers think about this? Because I had a conversation with a couple of my colleagues, and we've coined this term, the naked teacher. You know, when you strip away their reliance on PowerPoints and so on. I'm not like I want to be careful here because I'm not judging anyone. I'm simply reporting what I see.
Yeah.
Um, and sometimes they panic a little bit, and then I put out the post, and I just thought I'll just put out a post like, "Can you do it?" It was a bit of a kind of rhetorical question because of course most teachers can do it, and that came
Hmm.
across in the early replies was, "Of course I can, but of course I can, but." There was always a but. And then I think
Mm.
we're going to the replies got even more fascinating because there was a divide between old and new. And I thought that was
Hmm.
so fascinating because I then started getting comments and messages and replies from teachers. And it always started with, I was trained to teach in the 70s, I was trained to teach in the 80s. This was how we do it.
Yeah.
And then you'd have other ones saying, well, um, PowerPoint helps guide my thoughts. It kind of helps me shape the lesson. A carefully constructed PowerPoint, and that got me thinking again because you know, of course, a carefully constructed PowerPoint and so on. And when teachers always talk about being busy, can you have a carefully constructed PowerPoint for every lesson? I don't know about that because in experience, you'd go into departments and you open up the server. I don't know if you can speak to this, Toria, but you open up the server and you have the block plan PowerPoint, but
Hmm.
then you have the block plan PowerPoint Darren's block plan PowerPoint Toria's, and then you've got because we
Hmm.
then go in and change it, and we go and adapt it to suit the children that we teach and the class we've got in front of us and our own style of teaching. And I find that all very interesting because what started off just a very generic yes or no, because I think in the post I said you only have access to a whiteboard, a pen, and the pupils will have a jot and a pencil.
Yes.
And that just promoted so much discussion and thought, and it was, as you mentioned, it kind of got a little bit crazy. I didn't expect so many people.
Mm.
It went on for a few days of people replying to me, talking to me, messaging me, and so on. And it almost struck a chord with people because I think we're at a point as well with technology. It's that kind of catch 22 because there's more and more people looking to ban mobile phones. There's more and more people realizing that technologies actually can harm children as well as be of benefit and so on. And also in my previous role, I taught an Engelmann's direct instruction program, and for anyone that's ever taught that, there is no technology involved in that. The teacher has a script, the
Hmm.
pupils have a workbook, and when I did that, the outcomes for the pupils was beyond my imagination or beyond my hypothesis, which kind of rings true to the research in that. So if you can get that sort of results without using a PowerPoint or any form of technology, then it got me thinking around what we could do if we did more. I think I called it analog teaching. If we just did a little bit more teaching like
Yeah.
that.
My brain is pinging with everything that you're saying because you're saying the word PowerPoint a lot, and it's really interesting because I don't know how many of the listeners have one, but most classrooms now are equipped with, or definitely in primary, interactive whiteboards.
Mhm.
And so in primary, you create these sort of, I'm going to say, we have Inspire whiteboards, and you create all your Inspire flip charts, etc., or whatever. And you create that and you pop it up on the computer. And the idea is that they're relatively interactive. And
Mhm.
actually, what happens, quite right, as you were saying, it's impossible to create that level of interactivity for every single lesson for every single day. If
Mhm.
that's what you're teaching, which is what I'm teaching every day in primary. I'm teaching all day every day. And and I've got to be honest and say, I don't know the interactive whiteboard as well as I should, I don't think. Now, I've thought about it a great deal, having spoken to you earlier. And I think actually, what can happen then is that we are producing PowerPoints for the children. We're not producing interactive whiteboard resources. We're creating PowerPoints, and the children are sitting there just watching these PowerPoints, and then the interactivity dies. And I don't know whether that's the same for other teachers, but I do wonder if that, because of the nature of having to create so many, that's what's happening.
I think you might be right, and I think you touch on a very interesting point because all the schools I've worked in Scotland. I'm a secondary teacher, and they've all got, I think it's Promethean smart
Mm.
boards that we primarily use, and many of my colleagues, past and present, have spoken about how it's simply a very expensive projector because we don't use a fraction of the functionality.
Mm.
I actually recall a CPD session I went to years back where the TV was on wheels and it could be flipped and turned into a table.
Ooh.
And there was things for the pupils to do on it. But then that person came back 6 months later and asked any teachers if they used it that way, and no one put their hands up because obviously
Interesting.
the day-to-day work um, that they do, just the busyness, and like you mentioned earlier,
Mm.
you're like I am. I'm not a primary teacher, so I can't speak to any of that. But you mentioned teaching all day, and
Mm.
in secondary we teach 5 out of 6 periods or 6 out of 7 periods, and it's sometimes class after class after class, so it's quite busy
Mm.
and it's quite onerous to create those things. But there's one of my colleagues told me that there was really no difference to what the interactive boards were to old acetate overhead projectors because you're just putting the same stuff. You're just making it a little bit more flashy on a PowerPoint. And you mentioned interactivity, and it's not the PowerPoint that produces the interactivity in lessons. I've had Bruce Robertson on a few times talking. He's a great advocate for research-backed evidence in Scotland,
Mhm.
and sorry, and he talks about this idea of direct interactive instruction, and I quite like that because what I found when the smartboard went off and I was just had my whiteboard and pen is that I was able to be more interactive with the pupils, ask more questions, have more
Mhm.
depends whether you call it think, pair, share, or turn and talk. I don't it doesn't matter the terminology you use, but have students talking to each other, formulating answers, writing down answers, sharing answers out. Um, that became more because there was less, dare I say it, children trying to copy directly from the PowerPoint, and
Mm.
that happens quite a lot, specifically in the senior phase.
Yeah.
Your studious students will try and note down everything that you see, and in the lessons I've observed, and I've said it myself, the teacher will say, "Don't worry about it. I'll put this on the team." We use Microsoft Teams quite a lot in Scotland. I'll put this on the team, so then students will slow down their note taking and then go and realize, oh, I can just look at it later at home. But then that's putting the study and the reliance onto what's in the PowerPoint. So then teachers then automatically go, I need to put more in my PowerPoint. And
Mm.
that trend is quite clear when you look at something, especially when you look at things that people have shared on social media. And again, I'm not judging, I'm simply reporting on what I see.
Yeah.
The somebody will say, oh, I created this PowerPoint for this block of work, and then you look at the PowerPoint and you go, oh my dear God, I can't even read that. There's so many
No,
things on it.
and then what about cognitive overload? That's the
Ex-
thing. We're talking the whole time about cognitive overload and not overloading these poor children in front of us. And then these PowerPoints are created that's just blows your mind.
yeah, it's exactly because I had a conversation with a student teacher just last week, and I've had quite a lot of chats on social media around cognitive overload, working memory, the transient information effect. I mean, I might butcher this. I'm not a cognitive science. I'm just somebody that's really interested. Um, and the external working memory field. And what's interesting is that if you go from slide to slide in a PowerPoint, that transient information effect and cognitive overload comes into play because we just don't have the time to fully understand these principles. And from my
Mhm.
understanding is that if you've got something on the slide that's important, it needs to be on the next slide as well. And then it got me thinking about, well, the whiteboard. So I
Mhm.
wrote or drew my explanation as I went on the whiteboard. I charted, I like this idea of charting. So when people's are discussing and you're getting things from getting discussion part of the classroom, you can chart what the pupils are saying, so then they can then look at that. And I think that harnesses that transient information because if I put things on the whiteboard, it stays on the whiteboard unless I rub it off. It doesn't disappear as I go to the next slide, if that makes sense.
Mm.
And if I'm charting the discussion the pupils are having and I'm putting it on the whiteboard and I'm writing
Mhm.
it as they're saying it and making my notes, I'm then demonstrating to them how to make notes. And then when it goes to the kind of more summative writing they'll do later on, that's on the board for them, so they can, if they've not remembered it, because of course you can't remember everything. We forget quite quickly. As you mentioned, cognitive load. They can then look at the whiteboard as they're doing that summative writing, and they can glance up and glance down, and they don't need to hold that important information in their working memory because the act of writing would fully overload their working memory. So they can then glance up and look at the whiteboard because it's more static, it stays there
Yeah,
compared to it disappearing immediately as you go from slide to slide as you work through your lesson. And I think, as I'm mentioning slide to slide, something that came into my head as well is that um, what's happened in my experience is I start to get through a little bit less work, but a little bit more depth and understanding. Because if you have a PowerPoint, people tend to just flick through. Oh, I need to get to the next bit. Hold
yeah,
that thought. We need to get to the next bit. And you're like, well, no, pause and reflect and develop that thought. And you can do that if you have no reliance on going from slide to slide, if that makes sense.
absolutely. No, I think you're completely right. It is that sort of driving through. If you've created the slides, you know what's coming next. It's like I'm working to this, I'm working to this, I'm working to this, I'm working to this, etc. And we've got some really great points that people have texted in actually that I'll read in a moment. But I just want to remind people that this show is brought to you in partnership with John Cat Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit johncatbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Now, Sam says that he thinks that we've made some really good points today, which is great. And he said that he's recently taken to not using PowerPoints and he thinks that it can be much more engaging than assumed. He said, I found it so useful in getting me to really consider my responsive teaching. And that's exactly what you're talking about. It really is. And Jenny says, agree. When you are teaching full time, multiple subjects, various abilities, it's really tough to do anything more than PowerPoints in primary. We don't have pre made resources that we can adapt. We have to start from scratch every single time. And the thing that is just brought to mind whenever you've been talking, actually, is the fact that we have a really massive push currently, definitely in primary. I don't know about so much in secondary, but on oracy, because actually the art of speaking and listening has really been impacted. It was impacted by COVID, we know that. But I wonder, Darren, as well, if it's been impacted by this lack of interactivity, where actually what's, our young people are becoming more and more passive as learners. And definitely within my own school, we're moving away more and more and more from creating PowerPoints to actually active lessons in which our young people are encouraged to talk and interact. And as you say, using whiteboards and all of those things. I mean, is that the same in secondary?
It's interesting you mentioned Odyssey, because obviously I think it also notes. I should also note there's a big stark contrast between what's pushed in England and what is pushed in Scotland.
Okay.
We're two very different and distinct and separate education systems. But the point you make is very good, because if we think about analog teaching, as I called it earlier, compared to getting through the PowerPoint, and experience and
Mm,
things I've seen and how I've done it myself, because going from PowerPoint to PowerPoint, there's more um, things like copying down. There's more things like children just sitting passively listening and so on. And I think that comes to a good distinction on active learning. Previously we've been told that active learning is the children just running around the room trying to find different things that you've scattered there. I know that's a very kind of low level crude kind of thing in it, but the point remains, because active learning actually is that process of the students actively engaging in the material you're
mm,
presenting. And if you can present that through your explanation, I think what I've found with teaching at the whiteboard and noting things down is that I need to be very deliberate in my explanations. I don't think there's enough um, done about. Sorry, I don't. It's not done. I don't think there's enough CPD on how to craft effective explanations. I know that Andy Tharby wrote a book a few
mm.
years back, and most recently, the one I've been most captivated by is Adam Boxer's book on science. And although I'm not a science teacher, his section on explanations is so wonderful that I took so much from it. And I know that Zach Rochelle's got one coming out recently called "Just Tell Them," and I find that an interesting concept, because I agree with it, and we need to just tell the things and be very economical with our language. What I learned from doing the direct instruction is that a clear principle of Siegfried Engelmann and Douglas Carnine was this idea of faultless communication. Very hard
Mm.
to pin down yourself, but I noticed when I was teaching that program that it was very, very well thought out and structured what I was saying, to try and almost, it's impossible to do, but almost eliminate any confusion. But I think that's
Mhm.
when the interactivity comes in. You explain something as best you can, and then you do what I call checks for listening. I think I can't remember
Yeah.
who I got that from. I'll kind of point out that everything I say has been stolen from someone else and tried to reorganize in my
Best
own
way.
brain. Checks for listening and checks for understanding, and
Mhm.
checking for understanding is one of those things that we know how to do that, but I don't think we think deeply enough about checking for understanding. Can't remember which edition of Teach Like a Champion it was in. I think it was one or two, and um, Lemov called checking for understanding the soul of teaching, getting into the soul of teaching. And I remember that resonating with me so beautifully, because regardless of how well we explain things, with or without PowerPoint, there's always going to be a gap between teaching and learning, that teaching and learning gap. There's always
Mm.
going to be errors are always going to arise, because we're working with pupils who are developing humans, their brains and emotional regulation is all over the shop. So there's always going to be errors, and it's how we respond to that. I think somebody mentioned responsive teaching earlier on. It's how we respond to that
Yes.
that makes all the difference. And I think if we're not stuck behind our desks pushing the space bar to get to the next slide, we can be way more responsive and get in amongst the pupils and circulate more and get more people to talk. I think the original point was on Odyssey, and I think that getting more people to talk and giving them a structure to talk within is definitely something. I worked with a probationer a year back. in Scotland, when you train to teach, you get guaranteed a what's called a probation year. So they're kind of the newly qualified teacher. So I do a lot of work with probationer teachers and try and support them in their development, because obviously they're just at the beginning of their career. And I did some work with them around teaching pupils how to structure their conversation, because often pupils and adults, especially on X, we just talk over each other rather than structuring things like, I agree with Toria because, or I disagree with Toria because, and present my evidence.
Yeah.
And I think teaching that to pupils is really, really important to build that discussion, build that culture of safety and support in the classroom, and this idea that we're here to learn and not kind of, we can have separate viewpoints as long as we present the evidence and speak clearly, because it definitely allows you to interact with the pupils more. I remember that one of the lesson a few weeks back, and I think it's one of the Rosenshine's things where he says the best teachers ask 80 or more questions a lesson, and I certainly found myself asking a lot more questions, a lot more than I would do if I was just going from slide to slide in my experience.
Yeah.
And I think that helps for your Odyssey, getting more people to say more things. You know, if a pupil has to respond 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times in a lesson, you're not only developing their Odyssey, you're developing that kind of, I think Alex Quigley or somebody else called it disciplinary literacy. So you're developing that because you're then encouraging them to use the language of that subject and
Absolutely.
discussing that.
And I think, I mean, in my school now, we've actually developed talk phrases, talk language, etc., which we've taught the children, which I think is, and I've got to say, teaching has changed, learning has changed because of it. But I've actually got Sam here, who was the person that mentioned about responsive teaching. And Sam, if you unmute yourself, do you want to pop on and tell us what you want to say?
Yeah, I actually completely agree with both of you were saying. I think some really good points have been made today. So I teach secondary history in England. And one of the big things we find is that pupils find it hard to find the sequence of events, the chronology of events. And what I used to do was just create a timeline on the PowerPoint. But what I found then was that was having exactly the same issues that you've both pointed out, that pupils would either just copy it out. They wouldn't really think about what they were writing down in response to the problems. So what I started to do was put the pen down, turn the whiteboard off, and just pen and whiteboard out. And I found actually pupils were much more engaged watching me do it. And I think that's something we've not necessarily touched on enough at the moment. The idea that pupils need to see teachers do the activity themselves. If we do the timeline, it's more interactive because you slow down and think about what you're teaching. I'm a really big advocate for walking, talking mocks. Now, granted, this uses a visualizer, so it's not quite just whiteboard and a pen, but it's not relying on the PowerPoint or a pre-made answer. You do the answer in front of them. And I found that had a massive impact on pupil outcomes. I think for the answers we use walking, talking mocks with, I think they were well above average for those specific questions we'd utilize that for.
That makes complete sense. I mean, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's, thanks so much, Sam, for mentioning that. And I think you touched on a great point, especially in secondary school. And you kind of brought back memories of my own history teacher. I loved history at school because the teacher did exactly that. They just stood at the whiteboard with a pen and engaged us from the very first thing. And I wanted to learn from them. And I think that's interesting, especially when you get to, we call it national qualification, national 5. I did standard grades at school, and I think you guys use GCSEs and A levels. But the children want to learn from you, and they want to see you do it. I think that's an important point. And Sam touched on an interesting bit there around the visualizer. You know, you can almost tag the visualizer into analog teaching, because if we go back to the original post, there was 2 things that people responded and messaged me back with saying, and that was most common, and that was, can I have a visualizer? So I would always put, well, I'm not in charge of you, but of course you can. And then the other one was, can the pupils have mini whiteboards? So that speaks to two different things. And Sam talking about using the visualizer, I've seen some amazing lessons and done it myself on using two kind of different techniques. And the first one was what Sam spoke to. You know, seeing a teacher, especially in the senior phase. I mean, as mentioned, I can't speak to the primary school. Maybe you can touch on that, Toria. The teacher going down sentence from sentence, explaining their thinking, especially in more essay-based subjects and those kind of written answers. The teacher writing it and it's saying the first sentence will be this, and I'm using this word because. And then you could then pause and say, right, what's the next thing I need to input into this? And then you can have the pupils discuss and share back. And although it's a little bit of a slower process, I think that builds that deeper understanding. The pupils are spending longer tackling and wrestling with that kind of piece of learning, as Sam spoke to.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, my visualizer is just on all the time. I absolutely love it. And I think what Sam you touched on was you said about the modeling and actually children need to see, or our young people need to see the teacher do those things. And that's what I've discovered with the visualizer. Actually, it is so much more beneficial for my young people if they see me do it. And what you're saying there, Darren, I mean, whenever I'm doing any sort of modeling of writing, I do it on the visualizer and I can discuss the language with the children, I can discuss other things with them, etc. And then they can see me create this in front of them. And I think the visualizer lends itself really well to that sort of creation. But my question to both of you, actually, I don't mind who jumps in first, is this. Are there certain subjects that lend themselves more to this analog teaching with whiteboards and visualizers? And are there certain subjects where actually it's much harder?
I guess so. I mean, of course, the academic subjects, so to speak, such as history or maths and whatnot, would rely more on key knowledge and academic knowledge. Where a subject like art or design technology, I mean, teachers there who would know better than me on this, by all means, jump in. Perhaps less so because their knowledge is more subjective. So yeah, of course, those challenges are there, but I think every subject can still use them. Every subject still has helpful knowledge, the key things that pupils need to know by the end of that lesson, the key concepts that are regarded within that lesson. So I think it's useful in every subject, perhaps just more so in others like history or maths.
Yeah, I think
think
that's a great point. Sorry, Darren, crack on.
No, sorry to interrupt you there. I think I agree with Sam there and what he said. I think there's certain subjects that lend it more, but I like to give two examples on visualizer use that I've seen in kind of more practical subject. The first one is in art. Normally in the art lessons I've observed, the teacher would get the pupils around a table and they would demonstrate the certain technique. Please forgive me, I don't know the terminology in art, but different techniques they'll use. But I then observed another lesson where the teacher had a visualizer coming down from the roof down onto their what have you paper, and then another one that had a big long arm. I've seen two separate ones, a big long arm, and they're used quite a lot in our technical subjects in Scotland. They all have these big long arm visualizers, and the teacher was able to do their work, model their drawing under the visualizer, so the pupils could see it. They could all see it quite clearly rather than trying to get a view around the table because it was on the big screen. I thought that was beautiful, and I suppose kind of looking at Sam said that they could all. That's an example of them all use it. And the second example I've seen that I thought was unbelievable was in music. And it was a keyboard lesson, and all the pupils had their own keyboard. And the teacher had a visualizer going down onto the keys, and the keys all had their letters on it. He'd obviously drawn on the keyboard. And the teacher was talking about hand placement for certain, to put the note, again, the terminology, the notes, and you could see on the board through the projected through the visualizer where their hands were, so the pupils were able to look at that and then compare it to their own keyboard and do that. So that's again modelling in that practical subject. I mean, I'm trained as a PE teacher, and there's no need for a visualizer in the game saw. That would just be a crazy thing to do. And we do utilize iPads connected to an Apple TV where I can video someone performing say we're doing badminton, performing an overhead clear, and then we can put it on the big screen and project it onto the wall, and we can discuss the features of what made that a successful or unsuccessful overhead clear, and that produces that little bit of a good learning. But when we go into the classroom for the academic parts of it, I've used a visualizer before, and a second use for visualizer that I got from Teach Like a Champion was this idea of show call. And something that I've done to great effect is that I've taken pupils' work, put it under the visualizer, and projected that onto the board, and going back to kind of oracy and discussion, getting pupils to discuss with each other how they can improve that pupil's work that's being projected on the board. So obviously you need to have the discussion with the pupils. You're going to do that. You can't just take someone's work and make them feel embarrassed. You need to have the right culture. But once you've got that and you show the work, the discussions that you can get from it, it allows the pupils to demonstrate their own understanding. Because if we put up, say I take your work, Tori, and I put it under the visualizer and it goes onto the board, I can then say, right, you've got 2 minutes to discuss. I want you to come up with one thing that Toria does well in this paragraph, and I want you to come up with one way in which Toria can improve that, and I want you to use evidence. And then the discussion kind of comes into light, the classroom kind of bursts into life, and they're engaging in discussing, they're comparing it with their own. And I've noticed a couple of things with doing that technique. Is one is that the pupils are able to demonstrate their understanding of the content even more. This idea of, and the second thing is that pupils were able to compare what Tori has written to their own writing, and you actually see some pupils they do it, they try and do it discreetly, where they'll rub out their own and they'll change their own writing. So you're not only improving Toria's work, you're actually improving everybody's work, because they're going, oh, I need to change that. And then the discussion that you have afterwards, the teacher can then rub out or score out Toria's work and then start to model their own thinking and take discussion from the floor. And rather than the teacher sharing that knowledge, the knowledge is actually coming from the pupils. And I've found that to be a quite powerful tool, especially with kind of a mixture of short and longer responses from the pupils, and the discussion that ensues from that it's really good, because the pupils are talking about, well, I think that Toria should have used this word, or needs to change that sentence, and so on. And it's so good to get the pupils to consider that themselves.
Well, this is going to age me completely. It really is. But I remember years and years ago, working party with Shirley Clark. And it was in the days before we'd even heard of visualizers. These, it was the days when technology was just sort of, it was opening up and so on. But we'd never heard of a visualizer, but we were each given one of these things. And we were told what you need to do is you need to pop children's work underneath it. Exactly what you're saying, Darren, and do it positively and all the rest. And all of us in this group were like, oh, I don't think that will go down well. I don't think they'll like that. Oh, I don't think children will like their work displayed. Oh my goodness, how wrong were we? The children loved having their work shown. They loved the opportunity to discuss it. And as you say, actually, the great thing from an assessment point of view was that we could wander around and really see if children had understood the teaching from the discussions that they were having with their peers. It was mind blowing. But as I say, that was in the early days of visualizers and all of this business. Now everyone's trying to work out how old I am. Yes, I've been teaching since the age of dinosaurs, people. Um, but and I think we have come so far since that time. And actually, I've just been reading a message from John here, which says, I consider it a blessing that I learned to teach before technology became a big thing. It taught me how to engage. But now I use a motivational video at the beginning of every class. And John makes a great point, because he says children are so much more visual nowadays, so mix it up. And I think he's absolutely right. The fact that actually it's neither one nor the other. And that's what I'm here hearing from both Sam and you, Darren, the fact that we need to be really flexible within our teaching and use what works best for that lesson. And Anastasia says there are times when I don't use a PowerPoint and call it going old school. I can work easily through discussion with the class, creating mind maps, etc. I love the freedom of no PowerPoint. The only issue, she says, is her handwriting. And I wonder how many of us out there are a bit like, oh, goodness, my handwriting, personally, I just love handwriting, and where I can, I handwrite absolutely everything. But I think handwriting can be an issue for some teachers and can be a bit of a fear thing. It really can.
No,
But
yeah. So
yeah,
you're
sorry,
touching on a
carry
good
on.
thing, because I've written quite a lot recently on the I call it the dying art. You know, in Scotland, we are going full leather on one-to-one devices. Every child having a Chromebook, every child
Mm,
having an iPad, and there's research out there that shows that, you know, I want to kind of reference one thing. I looked at a study recently that compared handwriting to typing, and they used
mm,
functional MRIs. And I'll see if I might see if I can find that again. I think it was
ooh,
on in our Drive blog, actually, from Bradley Bush.
mhm.
Um, when the people being studied were writing, their brain lit up like a firework display. It was
Wow.
so alive with neurons firing and so on. And you compare that to the dullness that you can see when people type. And
Mm,
I think you can speak to, if you get the pupils writing to think I mentioned the word summative writing earlier on, and I think it was Douglas, a blogger out of Douglas Mauve, that he
mhm,
talks of the distinction between formative writing and summative writing, because getting you to think and writing gets you to solidify your thoughts and think that a little bit deeper, because you're having to commit it to paper, and it brings me to two things. Number one is that I use a lot of formative writing, that I get people's to I ask a question, I get people to write their response. Then
mm.
I get them to compare the responses with their peers and have a discussion. And then I have a classroom discussion, cold call, get people to share their own responses, agree and disagree with each other. And then I give them time to change their answer. At that point, it becomes a little bit more summative. And I think having more practice like that, more like series of like banding a few techniques together, like that, encourages the pupils to think that a little bit deeper, and that form thinking writing is that so much more powerful. And it's also this kind of another way to do it is get them to use the mini whiteboards. That came out quite a lot, was
Yeah.
in the original post, was a lot of people said, well, what about mini whiteboards? And I know many people love mini whiteboards.
Oh,
I wrote about that just this week, about why they're so powerful. And I referenced Bruce Robertson earlier on, and he writes in his books that mini whiteboards are as integral to lessons as jotters are. We call them jotters in Scotland. I think you call them books in England, but we
no,
call
I
them
still call
jotters.
them jotters because I'm from Northern Ireland, and
Oh,
I started calling them jotters, and everyone looked at me and they went, "What's a jotter?" Honestly,
I love that.
honestly, it was like, and I was saying it in my Northern Irish accent as well, which and everyone was going, "What on earth are you doing?" Or have you got the jotters? Anyway, that's a complete aside, everyone. Let's go back to mini whiteboards, because they're absolutely vital. I mean, again, mini whiteboards in primary, I think, are just that staple. But I've talked to secondary school teachers who that they're not that staple in the secondary classroom, which surprised me in some secondary classrooms. I'm not saying all, everyone.
Yeah, I think I don't like. I can't speak to primary schools, but I've got a hunch on that.
Oh,
I think the reason for that is that when I've been in primary, I had the privilege of teaching in a primary school a couple of years back, because a local primary school was struggling, had quite a bit of absence. So I then taught a primary six class for an afternoon a week for a few weeks,
mm,
and I thoroughly enjoyed that. And one thing that stuck out to me was the incredible routines that the pupils had. So, for
yeah.
example, at the end of the day, I didn't need to tell the pupils who needed to tidy up what. Now, for example, when I teach a badminton lesson in secondary, I've got to be very explicit on who's putting the net away and who's putting the rackets away. Whereas in this primary school I was in, it got to the end of the day, and whoever was appointed the leader that week, and they knew their role, and whoever was in charge of the books that week knew their role, and it was just so beautiful. And I think that comes to the difference between secondary, a difference between secondary and primary. And I might be wrong on that, and that of course there's always exceptions to what you say. That I think a lot of secondary schools just don't have the routines of getting them out quickly enough and keeping them clean. Whereas primary schools are just that little bit better. It could be because you have the same children.
It's interesting because my maths class, no, that when we have maths groups in my school, so I teach one of the maths group, and so all the children move around for maths groups, and when they walk into my class, they know the first thing they do is they grab their mini whiteboard, and they sit down, and there's something on my board, and they know that that's the very first thing they do when they walk into my classroom. And I don't get the whiteboards out, I don't put them away, the children just know where they are, they need to get them, and so I think you're absolutely right. I think primary teachers put routines in very, very, very early on in September, in order for those things to flow, really.
And I think that's an issue that secondary have. But I think it's just some people don't. It's one of those things that when you talk to colleagues who use them, they say, once I started using them, I've just never stopped. I use them all the time. And you have other people who have just never started and don't know what to do with them because they're so flexible. Mini whiteboards. I taught mathematics for a period of time in my last school, and I used a mini whiteboard in almost every lesson. And I used it for two functions. First was kind of to check prerequisite knowledge and have like a little mini quiz, like a retrieval practice based quiz. And second, to ensure understanding before they went off and did a block of independent practice. So you would put a few questions on the board and get the pupils to respond in mini whiteboards. And if they got them all, if they were getting a series correct, you could say, right, go and do the task in page 29 in the textbook. Whereas if there was a couple of pupils who weren't quite getting it, you could then, as you mentioned, respond to that. You can go and offer them further support. You can try and explain it better. You can slow down. You can speed up. You can kind of discuss what exactly they're not getting, because you don't want to set them up for success and just put them straight to the worksheet because they're ultimately going to get them all wrong. So you wanted to make sure they were confident before they went into that. And I think once you find a way to use them, then it becomes a lot better. I think they're easy to use when there's 1 or 2 word answers, but when you get to longer word answers, I think that becomes a little bit harder for teachers. And I think that could be a barrier, especially in the secondary school, in the senior phase, and we call it your kind of later years, your certificate years, when the responses the pupils need to give are a lot longer. I use it with my higher classes to just check they have the certain knowledge they need, the 1 word, 2 word, 3 word answers. But I don't currently use it for longer form answers. But I'd imagine there will be people that have excellent routines and strategies for using them in a longer bit. And I think mini whiteboards are so powerful for a number of reasons, that it allows that practice before people commit things to jot. So I spoke about formative and summative writing. Mini whiteboards are that formative writing. And I think in a piece of some things I've written, I've compared working memory to a mini whiteboard, because as we discussed earlier for cognitive load, working memory is so limited in its capacity and what it can handle. And it's almost like a mini whiteboard because it can erase so quickly. But I think differentiate for the children, your jotters for your summative work, your mini whiteboards for your formative work, you can check their work on their mini whiteboards. It's easy to erase and easy to think. I think you have I don't know what it's like in your experience. I've experienced a lot of pupils who they just hate having to rub things out. They want to get their jotters beautiful and get them right first time. And I think having a mini whiteboard allows them to make the errors. And once they've got the errors ironed out, they can then commit it to their jotter and keep their jotter looking beautiful. I don't know if you've ever experienced people like
Well,
that. I've experienced
yeah.
many.
I think you're right. I think there is something about that the level of the fact that actually a whiteboard does allow greater freedom around errors. And I'm just interested, if you're listening to this live, do let us know if you use mini whiteboards in your classroom, and if you're primary and secondary, and if you're secondary, what subject you teach. Because I'm just interested actually, how many people out there are using mini whiteboards, because I think it is something that in primary we just accept as this is what we do, but I don't know as much about secondary. Now, I just want to remind everyone that this show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. And Darren, you were saying actually interestingly about using whiteboards, but using it for maybe shorter answers rather than longer. And I think you're absolutely right. The mini whiteboards are really, really great for when you want quick, short answers, but they aren't so great if you want a long answer written to something. And I think that is when the jotter book comes in. But again, you're right in that lots of our young people don't like to make mistakes because they feel that when they need to put something down, it needs to be the right thing. So, I mean, is that a barrier to learning?
Possibly. I think what we've both touched on there is obviously young people have a fear of making mistakes.
Yes.
And I think we've kind of touched on that point there, and perhaps using a mini whiteboard offers them that support because of the
Mm,
easily erasing. But I think that comes into something that I'm not really that well versed in, but I know that other people will be, is this idea of growth mindset and
mm,
celebrating mistakes. And I've read a little bit about how we need to celebrate errors. I think when I spoke about the idea of show call earlier on and bringing people's jotters up and put them under the visualizer and getting the other peoples to improve the work through discussion and collaboration, that's kind of building in a culture of error. And
yes.
Teach Like a Champion, Doug Lemov talks about culture of error, and I think if I think critically about my own practice, it's not something that I've really spent that enough time doing, having this culture of error and using phrases like thank you, Tori. I love that you've made that mistake. It's going to help us all learn.
Mm, mm,
Let's look at what Tori put and see if we can make it better. And by doing that, it then shows that, well, if Tori is making mistakes, then and I've made a mistake, that's fine. We're all going to work together, and it's going to get in that culture of error in your classroom so that everyone's okay with making mistakes. And but like there's and if I can say so, a lot of these people that we've identified, they tend to be girls that love to keep their books nice and neat, and they
mm.
use highlighters to color code their books and so on. So it's supporting them and getting them to recognize that learning's messy. It's a confusing, hard thing because Graham Nuttall's research that he published, The Hidden Lives of Learners, showed that in a classroom, pupils will know. I think he quoted up to 50% of what they're about to be taught, but the 50% is different from pupil to pupil.
Hmm.
And a lot of our learning, we want deep understanding. I want them to attach meaning to it, and supporting these pupils to recognise that errors will be made, errors are okay, errors are fine, and your jotter's not meant to be so beautiful. Your jotter's meant to be messy. It's meant to be full of mistakes. It's meant to be full of things, because what you want to see in a jotter is that the beginning of their jotter, the first third or half of their jotter, is riddled with mistakes.
Mm.
And then the second half become so much clearer and so much structured because they've learned the structures, they've learned the how to take notes, they've learned how to use tier 3 language, or the disciplinary literacy in the subject. They've learned how to kind of make sure their answers are filled with evidence and so on, and you're almost demonstrating learning throughout the year in one of their jotters.
Yeah. I think you're spot on. I think that the idea of that, learning is messy. And I think getting them to understand that actually, it's not always going to be messy, but until it's organized within your brain, it will be. And that the jot is, in a sense, representative of that. Now, thank you to History Geek, who has texted in, because History Geek, don't know your name, has put that they teach secondary, they teach history, that's History Geek. And they have used mini whiteboards a lot. In fact, they use them every single lesson. They're at a new school now, and they haven't built the routine in yet. So, Darren, you're spot on about the importance of routine to using things like the mini whiteboards. And they say that this is the only thing stopping them from using them at the moment. At the new school, they will use them again, but they need to set other routines expectations first. So that's a really interesting thing, actually, that in secondary, it's not necessarily that the routines aren't there, but there are other things that maybe need to be put in place first. So I think that's a really useful one. I want to move on slightly here. So I'm going to jump, and I'm jumping to phonics. And the reason I'm jumping to phonics is because I find it fascinating that you, Darren, a Scottish educator who teaches secondary PE currently, is interested in phonics and the importance of, the science of reading and phonics and all that. So, how on earth has that come about?
Well, you mentioned at the start, I host my own podcast, Becoming
Mm.
Educated. And in that, I started off years ago. I think it was 2020, 2021 I started. And I started because I didn't even know that people wrote books about education. As silly as that sounds now.
No, it doesn't
Uh,
sound silly. I'm with you.
I went through my teacher training. There was just the odd psychology books and so on, and bits and pieces, but I didn't realise. Of course, I knew like Dylan William had written books. So maybe that's a bit of a kind of gross misrepresentation. So obviously, I'd Dylan Williams, and I had heard of Shirley Clark at that point as well.
Mm.
But I didn't realise people like teachers were writing books. So I picked up the Learning Rainforest, Making Every Lesson Count, and it just opened my mind and my eyes to, oh my God, people actually write about education. People like about this stuff. And fast forward a few years, here we are on a Sunday morning talking about it for Teachers Talk Radio.
With 20% off
Shows
John Catt, everyone. Just saying, 20% off John Catt. So you can read all these great books, so do go there. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
so as part of the podcast, I also hosted an online conference for Scottish education called ScotEd. So I doubled this up, and I had a wonderful lady called Anne Glennie on my podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to let my dog out. So I had Anne Glennie on it, and Anne Glennie is a literacy consultant in Scotland. She was a primary
Mm-hmm.
teacher, and she submitted a number of petitions to the Scottish Government asking for the government to mandate synthetic phonics to be taught to new teachers in ITE so that everyone has an understanding of teaching and reading. And then when I spoke to her on the podcast, I think I spent a few hours talking with Anne, and it just blew my mind. One, I didn't know. In Scotland and under the Curriculum for Excellence, literacy across the curriculum is an expectation for everyone, not just primary teachers, not just English teachers. It's an expectation that everyone does it. And there's benchmarks, and we call it experience and outcomes for everyone. But having said that, I didn't know a jot about how people learn to read until I came across Anne. And then that, of course, got me down a rabbit hole. Like the writing on reading, the reading wars, as they call them, the books and articles and research into it. It's an absolute minefield, and you could get lost so easily. And combined with that, I was finding that more and more pupils in secondary were unable to read and write. You know, if you look at our
Mm.
the amount of people with additional support need, the SQE are reporting that it's going up and up. It's at a record high just now. It's getting ever higher every single year, and most of that is for a reader and a scribe, because the children cannot read and write.
Wow.
And that's something that almost all secondary teachers in Scotland will battle with in some way or form, and we're having to scaffold our lessons, differentiate our lessons, and kind of reduce them to such a, dare I say it, a low level.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because children in Scotland, we don't use systematic synthetic phonics like you do in England. So
Mm-hmm.
if I could take you back in the late 90s, early 2000s, Rona Johnson and Joyce Watson published what was called the Clackmannanshire study. And they compared synthetic phonics with analytic phonics and no phonics
Mm-hmm.
in their study. And they found that the children that received the synthetic phonics, it was an old version of Jolly phonics they used in their program.
Mm-hmm.
The children, by the end of primary 7, so it was a longitudinal study, by the end of primary 7, these children were 3.5 years ahead of their chronological age in reading and 1.5 years ahead of their chronological age in spelling. Now, the results were mind-blowing. And they even wrote in their longitudinal study, which was funded by the Scottish Executive
Mm-hmm.
at the time, and when it was released in 2005, that the evidence was unequivocal. Systematic synthetic phonics is the best approach for teaching children to read.
Mm-hmm.
And off the back of that, you got the Sir Jim Rose report in 2006, which pretty much putting the wheels in motion for what England have now. And fast forward to 2024, in the Pearl study, England are one of the top English-speaking nations in terms of that. And there's lots of things. You can get into debate about the quality of programs and so on, but at the basic level, Scotland don't use systematic synthetic phonics. They use approaches that, of course, have synthetic phonics in them,
Mm-hmm.
but they also have balanced, let's say, whole language analytic phonics in the program, which results in the programs using the 3Q and the multi-cueing method. Now, anyone familiar with Emily Hanford's work in America, Sold a Story, and the work in England is that the cueing method, I think you called it searchlights in England back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
The cueing method is flawed. It's fundamentally flawed. It fails children. It harms them, and that they then can't read because they begin to use, it encourages them to use context clues and guessing. For example, if you had a book that said Toria has a horse,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a picture of a horse and the people said pony, they're almost right, but they're not right. They've not read the word, they've inferred, they've guessed. And that cueing method is quite prominent in Scotland, and it has predictable boots like Toria has a cat, Toria has a dog, Toria
Mm-hmm.
has a horse. And obviously in each page, the picture will have a cat or a dog. So I've kind of gotten a little bit righteous, so I don't know what the right word is, around phonics instruction. And the latest petition that I'm going to put forward was actually knocked back by the Scottish Children and Young People Parliamentary Committee. I think it was they change the name of these committees quite often. And interestingly, the MSP that had the wielded the axe on it, is to say, was a former primary school teacher. So it just gets into a few things, and it's interesting. There is a lot of criticism for asking governments to intervene in things, but something as fundamental as learning to read and write, it shouldn't be left to party politics. It shouldn't be left to teachers to self-direct. I think what you find in Scotland is that some teachers will say, "Oh, I use systematic synthetic phonics. I use this program but they'll also tell you that they have to hide it when the local authority comes in. They'll also tell you that they're not allowed to use it anymore because their local authority pays for X program that has analytic phonics on it. And what you'll notice with a lot of these people, a lot of Scottish teachers their accounts are anonymous because of this kind of culture that's been created. But the research it's really overwhelming in that learning to read requires systematic synthetic phonics to be able to decode the words on the page. And so obviously that's not everything, that's not everything. Goff and Turner's Simple View of Reading mentioned word recognition and language comprehension. There's more to reading than just decoding the words, because once you decode the words, you need to understand the meaning, you need
the whole
to
Scarborough's
comprehend the
rope
words
and all that.
Yeah, so there's lots to it, but I think in the meantime, Scotland needs to take a cold hard look at itself in terms of learning to read, because I think there was something like 30 odd percent of I think 27% of the school of a secondary age children are recognised as dyslexic. And obviously to challenge that would be quite bold, but I'm not sure if they are. I'm not sure if they just haven't been taught to decode the words on the page, because research would tell you that the incidence of dyslexia would reduce. I don't know what the incidence of dyslexic children is in England, because obviously those living with dyslexia, it's a challenge. It's hard. It's a challenge for them to get by in everyday life, and it's something that they need a lot of support with. But I do wonder if some of the children that have been told they're dyslexic, if we just taught them to read and break the code, as it were, they would perform a little bit better. But it's not perform better, it's being able to just think, it's think and read.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. You really have, Darren, because what you've said is that actually it is about children learning that code, because reading fundamentally at the very, very basic level, the phonic level, is breaking that code and understanding the code in order to word build. If they haven't got that ability to word build, then actually they're never going to get onto the point where they can actually develop their comprehension, develop their understanding of the meaning, and so on. And actually, then I was thinking about something that you mentioned earlier, which is the disciplinary literacy, because I mean, there's so much now that's been written about disciplinary literacy, which is tricky to say, but the fact that actually, that you can learn to read, incredibly, and this is something that we're finding in England, and I'll be interested about any secondary colleagues in England that are tuning in, what your thoughts are. But actually, young people reading for subjects. So for example, reading for history is completely different to reading a science report, to reading something that is to reading a novel, to reading there are so many different ways that we write, and we need our young people to understand them, that actually disciplinary literacy is actually quite an issue. And if you track right back then to what you're saying about Scotland, where actually they haven't even built up their word level, then how on earth can they be prepared by the time they reach secondary to actually begin to really unpick subject specific language and how it's written? Sorry, yes. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
No, you're definitely right, because you can't expect to understand if we use scientific language, because it tends to have the most tier 3 words. That's why I use the language tier 3, because that's what there's a great book called Bringing Words to Life by I can't remember their names. I can't remember their names. I apologise. And how can a child understand what a chloroplast and a nucleus and cytoplasm is if they then try and explain their thinking and writing and they cannot spell them? They're never going to be able to access that and things. And something I'd like to touch on, I don't want to get into that today, but the children that are furthest behind in reading tend to be the children that display the most aggressive, low level, distracting behaviour. And it's not because they're just using strategies to try and avoid the work. Whereas if we actually taught them to read, then they would be that little bit more successful and taught them to read well. And I find it so strange that in today's society, when we know how, like there's a line in a book by Professor Diane McGuinness, who sadly passed away, and she's extremely influential to a lot of people that I know in her books. And the first line in her book says something along the lines that, believe it or not, we actually know how to teach reading so that all children can learn to read. And I think Emily Hanford's Sold a Story podcast by APM Reports is the Apple podcast series essential for this month, and it's a must listen for anyone that is interested in reading and how we've got it so wrong over so long. And I think what's interesting in Scotland is how England, off the back of the Clackmannanshire study, Clackmannanshire is the smallest authority in Scotland. I think it's only got 3 secondary schools in the authority, and for them to see so much success with the study by Rona Johnston and Joyce Watson, and for that success to be recognised the world over, it was referenced in the National Reading. No, was it? Don't think it was actually. Sorry, I forget that. It was referenced definitely by Sir Jim Rose, and it's been referenced by academics in Australia, I think. And for that study to not impact in Scotland it's a real shame for the work that underwent in Clackmannanshire for that amazing results to be. They're not even just statistically significant; they're incredible. Imagine finishing primary school and the pupils in your class are 3.5 years ahead of their chronological age.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
No, sorry, that was my brain working because I suddenly was shot back to a couple of years ago where I was doing something on disciplinary literacy, and I was sitting with a secondary teacher who said actually they felt that we should do more disciplinary literacy in primary. And it's really interesting because, and I'm only talking for my school, everyone, I'm not talking for everyone else's. And if you're tuning in, do let me know if your school does more of this. But when we're doing our reading lessons or English lessons or whatever, we're not necessarily looking at subject specific language of history within our English lessons. We look at subject specific language within our history lessons. But they were saying actually it'd be really, really useful to look at the different language of different subjects earlier on in a child's sort of reading journey. So I don't. I think there's always a way to go, and actually that brings me back to you, Darren, which is about the science of learning, because actually. I said to you the other day when we were chatting, the fact that, yes, again, I did train in the day of the dinosaurs before anything was even known about the science of learning, or indeed, if it was, no one actually mentioned it to me. And actually, it's been fascinating. I I am passionate about teaching and learning. I love learning about learning and teaching, which is why I love chatting to people. But I mean, so little was known. And now there's more and more coming out there. And Darren, I suppose, what's my question? Am I just waffling on? I think I'm just waffling on at this point. But Darren, it comes back to your passion for science of learning and where to next, really, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you for that. With the science of learning, I've mentioned that quite a lot on my social media feed and in written forms. When I trained, and even now in Scotland, there's a big push on differentiation. Learning styles are still mentioned by school leaders and in forms. I think somebody mentioned earlier about children being more visual. There's a lot of, I think, not misinformation. There's just, like, Bradley Bush calls it the zombie myths that just never go away. But I think once we understand how the brain actually learns, we was talking a little about how the brain actually learns to read and how it builds up the word decoding and word building and so on. But also in general teaching, there are principles that are coming through from research. And I think what's interesting about these things is that the research has been going on for decades. I think Kate Jones wrote in her retrieval practice book that retrieval practice was researched as far back as 1903. You're like, wow, that's a long time. And I think there's a lot of criticism a lot of these things because people will say, it's just a different word for what we already do. And of course, it might be. It might be because good teachers have found the way to teach children long before terminology and different words came in. But I think understanding the science of learning really helps sharpen your explanations, your checks for understanding, your presentation of material, your questioning, and so on. Because if we go back to the very basics, the working memory is easily overloaded. That seems such a great concept to understand, but how many people know the terms of working memory and cognitive overload? I still speak to people and colleagues in Scotland who have never heard of them, but when you explain them to them, they go, "Oh yeah, that makes sense," and it's like a light bulb. So this idea of cognitive overload, although cognitive load theory, people say it's just a theory, and it does have kind of criticism because everything has polarization. But I think it's been so. Dylan William put a tweet out yesterday saying how there's so many randomized controlled trials looking at cognitive load theory makes it something it's just accepted science now. So we understand that the working memory gets overloaded quickly. It's so limited, but it can be backed up by our long-term memory, and we don't know the capacity of long-term memory because it just seems so vast. Look at the amount of people that can recite pi to a million numbers. There's a great book that I read back called Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer about memory championships, and he spoke about some of this in that book. So fascinating. But if we understand that if we build people's long-term memory, it helps support the working memory and makes things easier. If we understand that worked examples, we've spoken a lot in the show around modelling and working the examples on the whiteboard or under the visualizer. If we understand that helps pupils, if we note that doing it on the whiteboard harnesses the transit information effect and reduces the redundancy effect, it minimises extraneous load. I think Ollie Lovell came up with some good terms about optimising intrinsic load, which is the material to be learned, and the extraneous load. I think there's a researcher in Scotland, Carolina Cooper-Tetzel, who's part of the learning scientists. I think she's based in Scotland, and a couple are based in the other three are based in America. And she did a presentation a few years back about seductive details, how we put clip art on a PowerPoint, and how that just actually is redundant. It's unnecessary information. And we go back to looking at the PowerPoints that you see on social media, and some of them being so crazy and so messy. It's just full of redundant information. Understanding that reading off the PowerPoint, which is a feature of people using PowerPoints, they read directly off it, makes it redundant because our working memory has, like, the technical terms are a visual-spatial sketchpad and phonological loop, which I might be getting it slightly wrong, but I think it's basically says your working memory can access visual and spoken word. So this idea of geocoding became popular, and this idea, I think that kind of harnesses the idea of drawing and modeling your expectations. I think understanding all these things helps sharpen our explanations. It helps sharpen how we plan for retention and retrieval over time and be more strategic. If we accept that retrieval practice and spaced repetition are the two most effective methods to combat against forgetting. I think the science of learning helps us understand forgetting. I think we've all seen Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve, which I think was done in the 1880s. We know that forgetting occurs, and we know that it occurs rapidly. If you think of a secondary school where people goes to 4 to 6 lessons a day, if you have them period 1, by the time they got to period 6, they've almost forgotten the vast majority of what they learned period 1.
Yeah.
So the next time you see them, you need to bring that back. And I think the science of learning can really help us understand it. And although there is a place for philosophy, there is a place for, I think there's jokes made about French philosophers. And I think a lot of the teacher training needs to be around the science of learning and how we pupils learn. I think somebody shared with me one of the outcomes for the early career framework. Again, we don't have that in Scotland.
Yeah.
We have the General Teaching Council for Scotland that produces our standards for registration and our standards for career and professional development. There's a lot of them, and there's a lot of words in there. But I think the early career framework was a little bit more direct and the to-be-learned stuff. I think of course, I'm not part of that, but I've read criticism of how the workload attached to that. But I think there's a lot of good things written down and what teachers are to know and be able to do.
I think what
with that. And
what you've said
go
there
ahead.
about the science of learning. I mean, I know for me, when I suddenly discovered because this word metacognition was being bandied around everywhere, and I didn't dare say to anyone, what does that mean? And when I finally did discover what it meant, and then I actually understood how it related to my teaching, and then I understood how children were learning, it transformed my teaching. It utterly transformed it. So I think there is so much power to teachers truly understanding the science of learning. Now, I'm really sorry, Darren, but I know, listeners, that you'll all be screaming at me at this point, but we're coming to the end of the show. And I realised that we could talk for at least another 90 minutes just about the science of learning. But it has been phenomenal chatting to you, Darren. I have learned so much in these last 90 minutes. And I'm so grateful to you. Have you enjoyed being on the Sunday Social?
I've really enjoyed it, Tori. I was a little bit nervous before it started, but you've been so great in making me feel comfortable and allowing me to share my thinking and on various things. And I've really enjoyed sharing that because, through my podcast, I've been the passive interviewer.
Mm.
So to be at the other side of that and to share the things I've learned over the piece and how it's improved not only my teaching, but the teaching of others, because in my previous role, I was the principal teacher of teaching and learning, and I was able to share some of these things. So thank you for allowing me to share my thinking. I hope it's been useful for the listeners. I'm very grateful that you said that it was useful for you. So I really hope I've said a few useful things and provoked discussion, thought, and good debate.
You truly have. You really have. I mean, I always write notes when I'm chatting to people, and I've written pages and pages and pages from everything that you've said. So thank you so much for giving up your Sunday morning. So grateful, Darren. Thank you, listeners who have tuned in live for joining us. It's been really, really helpful. And for anyone that messaged in, again, thank you so much for joining us at Teachers Talk Radio. The Sunday Social will be back in another fortnight. So please, please, please come and join us then. And thank you to everyone. Please, as soon as the podcast is shared out, share it with everyone else so that more and more people can learn from Darren. So thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Enjoy it.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.